Hello and welcome to the December 18th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway here with Romeo Kokratsky.
Hey, folks.
This will be a news roundup episode. Next week we'll have more of a special topic, but with this one we have a variety of news topics for you, starting, of course, with the combat update, and this has been the story every week for the past many months, but the continuing deterioration of the front lines in especially the south of the Donetsk Oblast. And meanwhile, the return of scheduled power outages, most recently because of a very large strike by missiles, again, one of the largest of the war. We'll get into more detail of how extensive it was, but the addendum to that story will be the introduction of the F-16 as an important factor in the defense of Ukraine's skies. Then we have two interesting assassinations of Russian high-ranking officers, as well as the sinking of some Russian ships in the Sea of Azov, some various legal issues passing through the Ukrainian parliament, and then rounding it off with international news in Romania, Georgia, and Syria. Updates since the last episode, but some very important ones. So getting into the combat update. And as we've talked about in the last episode, the Russians have been frustrated in advancing directly towards Pokrovsk in the direction they had been doing so, and like I described last week, decided to push westwards to attack the city from directly the south. What I'm hearing from the city now is that it is in basically the final stages of any evacuation. Most people have been evacuated, but many of the people have been going into the city for the evacuation purposes or for humanitarian purposes or journalistic. You know, the various people who go into the frontline territories have described the city as being largely abandoned by now, with very few people. Pokrovsk was a city of about 60,000 people before the beginning of the full-scale invasion, now virtually empty, and even through most of the war, thinking that it was far enough away from the front lines that many people had decided to stay, they are now gone. Most of them will have gone towards Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Kyiv, etc. Also, in the main news outlet Romeo and I work for, New Voice of Ukraine, we have been posting a bunch of video of this evacuation process. So go to New Voice of Ukraine's Facebook page and soon to be YouTube channel, which I'm working on now. Looking south of Pokrovsk to the areas in the south of the Donetsk Oblast, we have been seeing a lot of encirclements in the last few weeks, unfortunately. The pace of the Russian attack, along with, I believe, some major failures of the Ukrainian leadership in the region of sticking around in places too long rather than retreating, has led to quite a few encirclements, meaning high casualties on the Ukrainian side, as well as being captured by Russian forces. One of these was at Hanivka. Hanivka was holding on for a long time in a very deep pocket. If you would look at the combat maps over the course of the last few weeks, it led to basically a narrow corridor jutting deep into the Russian lines with Hanivka at the end. That should have been abandoned. We usually avoid our backseat generalship on this podcast because who are we? We are not soldiers of any stripe, but that was a very obvious mistake that many others have been commenting on as well. And right now we are looking at Makharovka on the border of the Donetsk Oblast and Zaporizhia Oblasts. Within the last few days, that has been firmly cut off and fully encircled by Russian forces. These are mistakes that keep happening, and the demands to correct these mistakes are getting louder and louder. But if we look to the far north, to Kursk, the Ukrainian presence in the Russian oblast of Kursk, we have now reports that the North Korean soldiers are fully involved in combat operations. Earlier, there were some reports of them being involved in mixed units along with Russians, doing support roles, just being present in the Kursk region. Now we are getting reports that they are dedicatedly involved in full-on assaults in Ukrainian positions there. So North Korea fully involved in the war now, no more piddle-paddling beyond getting ready or anything like that. They're directly assaulting Ukrainian positions, though there are, mixed reports on how effective they are. Some soldiers that are being that are facing the North Koreans are saying that they are well trained, or at least as well trained, or in some cases better trained than some Russian soldiers in all possible roles that they are fulfilling. Others are reporting that, for example, when they're being attacked with drones, they do not have the training or experience that their Russian compatriots also have in avoiding them. Typically, when a drone comes, you get to cover. Apparently, the North Koreans are just kind of standing in the field and waiting to get hit, and are not using as sophisticated assault tactics as the Russians are using in general. Maybe their experience will catch up to them eventually, but at this point, they are taking fairly high casualties. So that is the update on where the North Koreans are at. We've all been wondering what they're going to do. Now we're seeing what they're doing. So looking towards Ukraine's skies, Romeo and I actually had a discussion shortly beforehand where we were saying that there had not been very many missile attacks lately, which usually means that the Russians are stocking up for a big one. When I had first arrived in Kyiv, there were, like I said, 2 nights where there were drone attacks, but nothing on the scale of, the big ones. And well, another big one finally came. On Friday, there was an attack by Russia of 193 drones and 90 missiles targeting, again, most regions of Ukraine, but mostly Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, Odessa Oblast, and Kharkiv Oblast. This led to severe power outages. We had already been on a schedule of power outages to serve electricity, but the day after this, I had to go pretty much the entire day without electricity. I only had 2 hours that next day because they had targeted various electricity generation facilities throughout the country. In Kyiv, they had already destroyed most of our thermal plants, so I assume the thermal plants that were destroyed or at least damaged were in other regions, and electricity just had to be shared to be more equitable, which is usually how it goes. When there are severe power outages in Kharkiv, Kyiv has to pick up the slack, for example. The interesting thing here, though, is that we know 11 of these missiles were shot down by the F-16s. The F-16s, we had not seen them so much in combat yet. Of course, the government likes to keep a lot of things on the hush-hush. We don't know where F-16s are deployed at any given time. But we do have it confirmed that F-16 shot down 11 of these missiles, which is one of the things that they are being asked for in order to do. Planes are capable of shooting down these missiles with pretty good accuracy. Other missiles had been intercepted by planes beforehand, though F-16s are just better than what was already in the Ukrainian stocks. So if these F-16s had been provided sooner or in larger quantities, more missiles could have been intercepted and more lives could have been saved. But we can't take back mistakes of the past. We can only look forward. So in the future, when Ukraine says it needs something, just provide it instead of dragging the feet. And we do this lecture every single time something like this happens, but provide Ukraine what it needs instead of piddling about with politics and saying, they're not ready for it. Ukraine's ready for anything, so just allow for it.
Next up are a couple of high-profile assassinations that Ukraine has pulled off in the last few weeks. The first was the death of Sergei Yevsukov, who was one of the head guards, or the warden, I guess, of a rather notorious Russian prison camp in occupied Ukraine in the village of Olenivka. He was blown up by a car bomb in occupied Donetsk. That particular assassination is unlikely to have any broader strategic or tactical effects. However, it does show that the Ukrainian military is not willing to let these people go. If you committed atrocities or war crimes against Ukrainian soldiers, you will be found. That's the message that the Ukrainian intelligence and special services wants to send very strongly to Russians, that if they mistreat us, which of course they have, they will, and they will continue to, they will face some sort of justice sooner or later. So Yevsukov's death was very much a cathartic thing for Ukrainians, especially for any of his victims that had the misfortune of being held at Olenivka. There are numerous documented instances of war crimes, torture, starvation, beatings, anything and everything you can think of that can be used to dehumanize a human. The Russians did it at Olenivka. So at least one of the architects of that horrific place is now rotting in the ground.
And Olenivka, I think, also has a lot of morale value to it as well. Olenivka prison, it's part of, a pretty big prison system that the Russians are maintaining in the occupied territories. But what makes this one unique is that it is the main facility where the Mariupol defenders were held for a long time. The defenders of Mariupol, many of them in the Azov, were captured and taken to various places, but many of them ended up at Olenivka, where, as Romeo said, they were largely tortured, starved, etc. And some of the explanations that came out after this assassination of people basically explaining why they are glad he is dead for those reasons. But the big one is that the Russians at one point blew up a large part of Olenivka. They targeted it with a missile. They, of course, evacuated the guards first before they did it, but they blew up this building and killed a lot of the Ukrainian prisoners of war who were held there. It was a mass execution. So that is why Olenivka really stands out in the Ukrainian imagination of the war, especially among Ukrainian soldiers and veterans who lost friends at that prison.
The next assassination, this is the high-profile one, possibly one of the higher-profile assassinations Ukraine has carried out since the start of the full-scale invasion, and that was against the Russian Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov. He was the head of their nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare protection troops. And according to reports, he was actually killed in Moscow by a bomb planted in an e-scooter. He was entering or leaving his apartment building on December 17th. And there was an e-scooter parked outside. As he passed it, apparently it went off. There was a bomb inside. It blew up and killed him on the spot along with his assistant. The SBU, Ukraine's security service, took responsibility for the assassination pretty much immediately after, just to make sure that there were no doubts about who killed him. This wasn't an internal Russian affair. This was 100% Ukraine's doing, and the Ukrainian government was happy to take credit for his death. Ukraine believes that Kirillov was responsible for authorizing the use of chemical weapons against Ukrainian soldiers. Now, there have been various reports by Ukraine that Russian forces have used chemical weapons against soldiers. There have been video evidence of planes dropping what experts have said are likely chemical weapons. And typically, we're not talking about mustard gas, but usually these are rather virulent and military-grade strains of tear gas. Victims have reported being unable to breathe, choking on their own spit, their eyes burning, just an all-around incredibly unpleasant experience. And chemical weapons are, again, banned by international law for very good reason. Not that the Russians have cared, of course. There is documented Russian chemical weapon use in Syria beforehand, and while there is no concrete confirmation that the Russians have used chemical weapons against Ukrainian soldiers, it is very, very likely, and Kirillov, again, was believed to be one of the officers that authorized and may have even proposed their use given his position as the head of the nuclear biochemical troops.
And actually, the day beforehand, a Ukrainian court had convicted him of the war crime of using chemical weapons. So this was a pretty loud declaration of basically how Ukraine would treat Russian war criminals in the future. They confirmed that he was, in fact, a war criminal. And because it's pretty well understood that some general sitting in Moscow is never going to be brought to justice, they were proactive in bringing him to justice in that way instead. So we can definitely expect more hits like this in the future. And probably, I assume, that they will come after a similar type of conviction, a declaration of what this person did wrong, why they're being killed, followed by them being killed, just to make it completely obvious that this is a matter of justice.
Now, the story doesn't end there. The Russians obviously are very interested in solving this particular killing. After all, Kirillov not only was a high-ranking officer of the Russian military, he was an officer that has been in personal contact with Vladimir Putin. The day before his death, he attended a staff briefing where Putin was reportedly present. And it goes to show you kind of the reach that the Ukrainian security forces and security services have now, being able to strike very, very high-ranking Russian officials within the heart of Moscow themselves. According to the Russians, they've, of course, arrested a suspect for this killing. They claim this is an Uzbekistani national who was paid $100,000 by the Ukrainian government to park the electric scooter outside of Kirillov's apartment building. I don't think this guy's life expectancy is very long. And of course, there is absolutely no way to confirm whether any of the accusations that Russia has leveled against this man, whether they are true in any way, shape, or form. We simply have no clue, and it's very likely the suspect will be dead before anyone independent even gets a chance to check. But if the Russians' story is true that this was an Uzbekistani national that was paid $100,000 and came to Moscow, this represents a threat surface for Russian security that they cannot possibly cover. Russia is incredibly reliant on Central Asian migrants, especially now, to run their economy, with the mass mobilization in Russia having either driven people out of the country, driven them into hiding, or is dragging them from their factories and workplaces onto the front lines. Russia needs that cheap migrant labor to keep functioning. It simply cannot, which means the Russian security services cannot crack down on border crossings. They can't really beef up security, especially the borders, with a lot of these Central Asian nations are incredibly fluid, incredibly, let's say, open to infiltration. And if it's really that simple, as the Russians seem to make it be, the Ukrainians contacted some guy for all intents and purposes, as far as the Russians have told us, and just offered him a bunch of money. I don't see how there is any possible way that Moscow can really clamp down on this kind of behavior. There's no way they can really protect themselves aside from more repression against migrants. But again, they need those migrants to run their country. Without Central Asian migrants, specifically, the Russian economy would shut down in basically a day. So again, that is assuming that the story the Russians have told us is true, and they haven't just tapped a migrant to be a scapegoat for violent crime, as they have many times.
Yeah, it could really go either way. Ukraine has recruited people in Russia in the past, and also Russia has found a random Muslim guy to blame everything on, as with the attack on the theater in Moscow.
Yeah, the Russians are, let's say, not the most competent at actually solving crimes. They prefer to commit them and then cover them up. They're really good at that part. Solving crimes, though, less so, because you have to have a strong connection with reality in order to solve crimes. And that is something Russian security forces very often lack. Of course, regardless of who actually did the killing, it's not a good sign for Russia. I've said on this podcast, I've said to friends, I've said in interviews that the only real way the full-scale invasion will end is with Putin's death, whether through natural causes or whether by assassination. And this just goes to show that Ukraine is getting closer to being able to threaten Putin's personal safety and personal well-being. That must be playing a role in his mindset, in his reactions, and of course, ahead of the probable negotiations that President-elect Donald Trump will force Ukraine into, though we'll talk about that a little later on.
Plenty of assassinations that take place within occupied Ukrainian territory of various occupation officials. Ukraine has killed a few lower level kooks and crazies in Russia, especially the daughter of Alexander Dugin or the traitor Ilya Kiva. But this is a high level and very public general, which is probably the biggest get that the Ukrainian spies have gotten thus far. But part of what makes him high profile is how I knew of him before this point. You don't really know a lot of there's a lot of generals in Russia. Like, it's a very top heavy kind of military structure. There's generals in charge of various things. But what made him stand out is that he's kind of been one of the chief conspiracy theorists of the Russian military and Russia in general. As the head of the unit that's supposedly in charge of protecting from biological and chemical threats, he's also the guy that has spun up a lot of the theories about supposed biological chemical threats from Ukraine. And that means the biolabs conspiracy theories about how Ukraine had all of these biological laboratories developing weapons that can specifically target Russian DNA Of course, when the Russians say that Ukrainians are just Russian, how can you develop a weapon that targets Russians? But beside that, it's all very silly nonsense. But he was the guy who was in charge of spreading a lot of these conspiracy theories, going on to various Russian news programs and explaining how the Ukrainians were developing mosquitoes that would attack Russian soldiers. That's a thing that he said. And then those were taken up by conspiracy theorists in the West and kind of gone crazy with it. So he definitely represents a part of this war which has been frustrating to track, but very important, about how basically creating this world of alternative facts, as the phrase is sometimes used, of these conspiracy theories and lies and utter nonsense that clogs up the information sphere. And the job he actually had before this was he was put in charge of a lot of Russia's response to COVID. So a lot of the conspiracy theories that Russia has been spreading related to COVID has also passed through his office. And that has been a large part of anti-Ukrainian hysteria in the United States, is basically attaching it to the various conspiracy theories and anxieties that developed with COVID. And we all saw how that turned out with the growth of QAnon conspiracy theories and things like that. That was all being partially drummed up by this guy. The Russians will find someone to replace him. They always do. But I really see him as one of the more dangerous figures in this war, specifically because of his role in the information war. Our next news item refers to two ships that sank in the Sea of Azov. These were two oil tankers operated by Russia, exporting Russian oil overseas. And this doesn't seem so strange. Ships sink. However, it brings up two very important subtopics that we haven't talked about so much before. The first of them is the shadow fleet. So why were these tankers able to sink? We saw the video. It's been made public of at least one of them just breaking in half. The bow of the ship just snapping off. And it was not in very rough waters. The Sea of Azov is pretty calm, all things considered. There were some pretty big waves, but nothing that especially an ocean-going ship should be able to handle. The Sea of Azov is quite shallow, and even the Black Sea is not that bad. Ships that can operate within the Black Sea and Sea of Azov are capable of being not as sturdy as something that's supposed to go out into, the high seas, Atlantic, Pacific. So why was this ship able to sink? Why was it able to break so easily in, quite frankly, water that I've been out on before in similar conditions? And, it shakes you a bit, but not, break down a oil tanker conditions. And it's because that Russia operates what's being referred to as a shadow fleet. This shadow fleet of ships is being called that because they are off any kind of regulations. They are run in order to avoid sanctions. They are not officially Russian ships or anything like that. They are not registered. They are just boats that show up in order to smuggle Russian goods, especially oil in this case, and sold illegally elsewhere. And with anything else, a ship that is off the books, as it were, is probably not very safe. It does not have to go through the same regulations and inspections that a ship you would usually have to go through, especially a ship as sensitive as an oil tanker. And these boats are all over the place right now. We had these two sink and a third one come close to sinking just within this last week. But these shadow fleet ships are all over the place, going all over the world, and they're all dangerous because of that. They are not being inspected. They are not safe whatsoever. But they are sitting in foreign ports everywhere. And because, again, oil tankers, they spilled oil all over the place, bringing into our second topic, which is environmental damage. Russia has gone... we had many episodes covering the various environmental damage that Russia has done. And in this case, their policies led to this massive oil spill that has washed up onto both occupied Ukrainian shores as well as Russia. And the Sea of Azov has had a lot of damage taken to it already. There was a mass die-off of dolphins, for example, near the beginning of the war because of the activity of the Russian military in the area. But now a bunch of oil is not going to help what wildlife may still be there. And because we know that these disasters can happen wherever, and because we know these ships are all over the place, we know that they can cause these disasters anywhere in the world at this point. So a lot of the time, the authorities know what these shadow fleets are. You don't have a ship show up, and just because it's off the books, nobody decides to ask questions about it. But they know that it's bringing in oil or whatever else at a price that is probably better for them than what those prices were beforehand, because Russia needs to sell things. And so local officials in many places are willing to overlook the presence of this extremely dangerous shadow fleet in order to line their own pockets. Hopefully, this will wake them up. Probably won't, because we know what the dangers are. This wasn't really a surprise. The only thing that surprised me was just how fragile this ship was. Just, again, in the video, it's stunning how little it took to destroy these ships. But there has to be this effort to find where these boats are and get various international authorities to follow through and do their jobs and not allow this fleet to operate, even if you can pocket some profit from it.
Despite the fact that smuggling on unregistered ships is illegal by most domestic and international laws, it hasn't stopped Russia from operating these fleets. And like Anthony says, the boats that they use are not really fit for purpose. They can't really use the typical giant mega carrier oil tankers as they used to, because, well, it's very clear that an unregistered oil tanker can really only be coming from one place in the world. So they resort to using these really shoddily built boats. A lot of them probably bought used or built as cheaply as possible to maximize profit margins. And while international authorities could absolutely use a number of tools in order to interdict these boats, they're not going to. It's clear at this point that the world has no interest in ensuring that Russian oil production falls, or that Russian oil trading falls beyond the quite easily circumventable sanctions. There is no active effort to actually enforce any of these restrictions on Russia beyond, well, at least don't wave a Russian flag when you come to sell oil to us. And that seems to be as far as international authorities are willing to step in. So I'm almost positive we're going to see more of these kinds of things, more environmental disasters, more cheap oil ending up anywhere, really, as long as Russia is constrained by sanctions, cannot sell to Europe, has problems dealing with its banks just generally. It's going to keep doing this.
And there were just a few reports on this exact kind of thing that came out a few months ago when the extent of these shadow fleets became clear. And it was well known that these are shoddy boats. It was well known that they are going to have disasters like this one. And it was known that they would cause environmental damage because of it. But no one paid attention because money. Our next segment here will do with two, I guess are calling them the legal issues of the week. Things that will pass before the Ukrainian parliament, or at least be considered by them. And the first one is one that is extremely unpopular in Ukraine, has been shot down at every opportunity. We're probably not going to see it in any kind of bill in the foreseeable future, but it is a thing that Ukraine's foreign partners, especially the United States, have been pushing for, which is the lowering of the mobilization age. Romeo, you are the one here who's actually a Ukrainian citizen, so it affects you and your family more than it affects me. So can you explain the issue of lowering the mobilization age and why Ukraine says no?
Ukraine is a country with a bit of a demographics problem. Our population is expected to drop from around an estimated 39 million to approximately 30 million by 2050. As a result, Ukrainians are incredibly cautious about taking any actions that would harm our demographic figures even more, and that does include conscripting 18-year-olds. So currently, the mobilization age cutoff is 25. This is actually a change from April. Prior to April 2024, the mobilization age was 27. Then in April, the Ukrainian government changed this to 25. And of course, the Americans, among other Western partners, have been pushing us to lower this age even further to 18. And while there is some logic there, it is a little strange that a country at full-scale war isn't making full use of its military age and able-bodied male population to fight and defend itself. Again, given the demographic issues that Ukraine is facing, it is rather understandable, especially that Ukraine has already lost millions upon millions of people. With the commencement of the full-scale war, an estimated 3 to 4 million people have left the country. Most analysts say that these are not people that will return even after the end of the full-scale invasion. They will remain to wherever they had fled to when the war started. And the continuation of the war is going to keep having a downward pressure on our demographics. And it is, even if you are not actively fighting, it's a significant concern now for people who are planning to start families or who want to have families in the future, whether it makes sense to at all. Things in Kyiv are usually more or less normal, but if you live out further east, closer to the front, if you live in a city that is regularly targeted by Russian attacks like Odessa, it is a significant question whether it's the time to have kids. And that really does mean that our population simply is not going to rebound for a while, if ever. Now, that's the Ukrainians' reasoning for why we haven't done this. Zelensky, the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, has also said that a big reason that Ukraine has not stepped up mobilization efforts is simply that we don't have the equipment to outfit all of the brigades that we have ready. This was, I want to say, about a month ago, where Zelensky commented at a press briefing that Ukraine currently has 8 fully staffed brigades that cannot be deployed because there is nothing to equip them with beyond infantry gear. But in an industrial war, you need industrial weapons, and that means artillery pieces, that means armored cars, that means mortars, that means ammo for all of this, electronic warfare systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot that goes into outfitting a military brigade that goes beyond simply giving everyone a bulletproof vest and a gun. And according to the Ukrainian government, we don't have the equipment necessary to outfit those brigades that we already have staffed. So presumably they are not really able to contribute because we don't have anything to contribute with. Conscripting a whole bunch more people will not fix that problem. More equipment isn't going to magically appear out of nowhere. As long as we have this deficit of materiel, according to Zelensky, there is no point in significantly deepening our mobilization efforts. But I think there is also an aspect here that the Ukrainian government does not acknowledge, at least not publicly, and that's the fact that the conscription process doesn't really work and hasn't really changed from civilian era. So I first went through the conscription process in 2016. Well, not technically conscription process. At that point, it was more like registering for the draft, pretty much. I had to go through the conscription process and go through the military checkups and all of that. And it was a very bureaucratic, very confusing, very kind of ad hoc and chaotic process. When I did go through that, and just recently I had to go through this again, and it has not improved, despite the fact that we have had nigh 3 years of full-scale war. Nearly the conscription mobilization process still hasn't, at least not in my hometown of Vinnytsia. It still is as chaotic, as confusing, and as unpleasant as it was in 2016. So nothing's really changed on that front, despite the myriad of reforms that Zelensky has promised and has tried to implement. It's clear that our recruitment offices and our draft boards and commissions and so on are not up to the task of properly recruiting a whole, hundreds of thousands or millions of new soldiers. Even if we had something to do with them, our conscription processes are just not well thought out. There doesn't seem to be any sense of real urgency among the staff at these recruitment offices that we are running. And on top of that, the most severe manpower shortage is in infantry. And as Anthony mentioned during the combat update, a lot of people don't have much respect for Ukrainian command, specifically Ukrainian infantry command. Infantry is seen as pretty much a guaranteed death sentence. We've heard stories from multiple infantry soldiers that their experiences were miserable, that they were abandoned by command. I remember there was this one, at least for me, very resonant story where a infantryman, I believe, somewhere near Charities, was forced to hold an entire line of trenches with him and his buddy who had been shot in the leg and obviously couldn't do anything. And command kept telling him to maintain position. They weren't getting medevaced. They weren't given orders to retreat. They were just told to sit there. And he eventually deserted because he did not want to die, which desertion is a complicated topic, but I think if you are the only person sitting in a trench and that trench and your command tells you that that trench is critical to the defense of whatever area your unit's defending, and yet they refuse to send reinforcements, I think it's quite obvious. A quite obvious conclusion to draw is either command is lying or the trench isn't worth it. And a lot of people have made that decision. There have been a record number of deserters reported by the Ukrainian military to the point where there's been at least one amnesty program passed by the military. I believe it was just a month ago or so, where the military told soldiers who had deserted that if they returned to their unit by some date, there would be no questions asked and they would not be criminally charged for going AWOL or for desertion. And again, this affects the infantry because they are the ones that are being forced to sit in these very miserable positions, especially when the weather gets worse and worse and worse. It's one thing to freeze your ass off in a basement, a couple dozen kilometers behind the active fighting, compared to freezing your ass off in a literal pit in the ground being shelled on a daily basis. I can't imagine anyone really appreciates that. And as a result, there's not a lot of infantry to go around.
Yeah, these manpower shortages, especially in infantry, have proven very difficult and has been highlighted as probably the biggest problem within the Ukrainian military, though, of course, the reasons for it, as you just went over, are the real problem there. However, there's an element to the political side of that as well, which is that, yes, these are all big complaints within the Ukrainian political sphere that have to be corrected, but at the same time, when it's happening to men in their 50s, 40s, or 30s, there is an element of just kind of swallowing the hardship when you're introducing that as, okay, now the 18-year-old kids are, they're adults, they're legal adults, they're in every other way, but people still will look at them as the kids of the country, the future of the country, and having them have to go through that's a whole different story. So many soldiers who've spoken to me on this even have said that we are here to save the future of the country. Why are you a 47-year-old, 55-year-old man standing in this trench when war is traditionally the profession of the young? It's because they see it as their duty, their responsibility of not making the young go through it again. And that has been a resonant line over and over and over again in many different contexts, is make sure that the future generations don't have to go through this. It has been the guiding principle of peace negotiations, everything. So tripping over that tripwire is very dangerous politically.
And of course, the U.S. authorities that have been pushing for the mobilization age to be lowered are not really concerned with Ukraine's demographic future. Let's be honest. This is not something anyone in Washington gives even the slightest of shits about. No one there is thinking, Ukraine might have a demographic crisis in 10, 20 years. That's not a concern. As far as the Americans are concerned, Ukraine is pulling its punches, is not fully committed. As ridiculous as that is to say, and they believe that if Ukraine is unwilling to fully commit itself to war, then it means that we don't actually need all of the kit and all of the complaints that we keep making.
And what I see this as is we have an outgoing administration that has made many, many mistakes regarding Ukraine, especially regarding the very just not enough material was sent to Ukraine, and the stuff that has been sent to Ukraine is old. It's all 2 generations behind what Americans are using. It's all and not enough of it. So the Ukrainians can very rightly point out that, like Zelensky pointed out, just don't have the material to equip every soldier that's there right now. So what's the point of more soldiers? And the Americans have to kind of deflect responsibility on it to say this wasn't our fault. We did everything we could. And we know that the next administration is going to be worse. At the best we can look forward to is some kind of outside shot of getting them to continue with their commitments. But the odds of things getting better are extremely low. The Trump administration will be worse than the Biden administration, but the Biden administration was imperfect. And we see a lot of the members of that administration trying to just blame Ukraine for all the failings that they themselves, in large part, are responsible for.
I mean, to give you a direct example, on Blue Sky, just today, I had fallen into an argument with a person that posted a photo of some new anti-drone microwave weapon. Looks like a giant concrete wall being held up by a car, basically. But it presumably, according to this poster, had a 100% intercept rate for a variety of drones. And I commented that it's very interesting that the U.S. develops these things and then never uses them and just warehouses them for 30 years before junking it. This person got very upset at me, accusing me of not caring about defending U.S. bases, but wasn't able to respond when I pointed out that the United States is currently not facing daily drone swarms that attack their civilian populations. That is just not a thing the U.S. has to worry about. If you have a piece of kit that has a claimed 100% drone interception rate at relatively good ranges, why is that at a U.S. base? What possible use could the United States have for it that they don't already cover with other equipment? And that's just to say that this is an example of all of this kit, all of this technology the U.S. military brags about that never, ever gets used. Most of the stuff that Ukraine is using, this old 30-plus-year-old American kit, has never been used in combat. This is the first time most of this stuff is ever being used in combat. It was created, it sat at a base, then it was transferred to a warehouse, then it was, in many cases, transferred to a demolition yard before someone decided to refurbish that. And that is the case for the grand majority of American military equipment. The United States, since World War II, has not really fought a peer opponent. I'm not counting dogfights with Chinese pilots in Vietnam. As a result, most of the Cold War tech and kit that was developed, created, maintained, produced, didn't do anything, didn't go anywhere. And it still isn't doing anything. It's still mostly just sitting in vast lots in the Arizona desert, baking under the sun. That goes for the new stuff as well. It'll go through the same process. We don't live in a world where the United States will ever be militarily challenged by a peer opponent. That simply will not happen, simply because ferrying troops across 2 oceans is basically impossible for any country that is not named the United States of America. No, China will not ever invade the West Coast. Russia won't ever strike the East Coast. Like there is no military threat, domestic military threat to the United States that could possibly be. The oceans are more than enough defense for basically anything. But yet you see these billions and billions of dollars being pumped into the American military industry, who come up and develop these quite fantastical, amazing weapons that are not used, never used, and are not planned to be used.
And to just cap off this discussion of the importance of conscripting 18 to 25-year-olds, there are just not many of them in Ukraine. If you look at the Ukrainian population pyramid of who is at what age cohort, there are a fair number of people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, etc. And then there just isn't a lot of people in their early 20s. People did not have kids 20 years ago, apparently, because of the economic problems happening in the country at the time. I've explained this in a past episode. There is, again, a bit of a growth of people in their teens, especially their early teens. There is another kind of increase in the Ukrainian population that happened, but there's just not many 18 to 25-year-olds. If Ukraine made the decision to conscript them, it would not make up a huge increase in the amount of manpower available compared to everything else. It's all kind of pointless from the beginning just because of that. But going on to our next topic involving domestic politics and laws under consideration, this one popped up to me today, actually, as I was going over my notes for the episode, and really caught my attention, is that Ukraine may be allowing people to have multiple citizenships. The current setup is that you can only have one, you can only be a Ukrainian citizen, but there's some flexibility to that. And Romeo, this is another one that you are much more equipped to talk about than I, if you can go ahead with that.
Sure. So Ukraine has a holdover Soviet law that forbids Ukrainian citizens from holding passports of any other country. What that means is not that Ukrainians are unable to have multiple citizenships. It's just that the Ukrainian government will not acknowledge if you have multiple citizenships. So, for example, if you are a Canadian, Ukrainian, and you hold both Canadian and Ukrainian citizenship, for all intents and purposes, for the Ukrainian government, you are only Ukrainian. And that goes no matter whose country citizenship you hold. If you are in Ukraine and you are a Ukrainian citizenship, any other possible nationality that you may hold is irrelevant to the Ukrainian government. Obviously, this has caused no shortage of problems, particularly for businessmen and politicians. It used to be, back when we had quote unquote normal politics in Ukraine, one of the main ways to harass businessmen and politicians, because very often these people would have multiple citizenships. It would be an easy way to go after them for holding these citizenships, for having, for example, dual Russian Ukrainian citizenship, dual Cypriot Ukrainian citizenship. That's a popular one. French Ukrainian, whatever it is. It would be an easy way to start prosecuting someone, harassing someone on criminal charges simply due to that fact. Again, this has long been seen as a kind of Soviet holdover, though obviously for the grand majority of people, it is irrelevant. Most people are only Ukrainians. There is not a significant population of multiple citizenship holders, except for perhaps Russian citizenship holders, but that's a little bit of a different story.
Well, there's people on the border who are dual Ukrainian, Hungarian, dual Romanian,
but that's a rather small population compared to most. So it's never been a significant factor. There's never been any political pressure to really change this, just grumblings and complaints from the small amount of people that do hold multiple citizenships. And again, the government itself kind of preferred this way because it made it easy to charge and open criminal proceedings against anyone you don't like. Anyone that the government doesn't like is likely going to be someone who is powerful and influential, meaning that they are likely to have multiple citizenships. Prior to the annexation and conquest of Crimea by Russia, it was incredibly common to get Russian citizenship because you would be able to collect two pensions, a Russian pension and a Ukrainian pension, and a lot of people did so. Though obviously after 2014 and as the time went on, the amount of people with Russian citizenship kind of shrank. People either stopped using their Russian passports or burned them, threw them away, or just immigrated to Russia. Obviously, after the full-scale invasion, being a Russian citizen itself has become something that exposes you to suspicion. The bill that has currently being passed would allow, or that is currently being debated in Parliament, would allow people to have multiple citizenships. However, it would also allow the Ukrainian government to strip Ukrainian citizenship from people who have Russian citizenship. That is, the Ukrainian government would have the ability to take away your Ukrainian passport if you have a Russian one. Something that currently is...
I have questions about this one. I think the Supreme Court
currently it's probably a popular measure for voters. However, eventually Ukraine will have to reintegrate the occupied territories, and Russia has pursued a policy of passportization where they specifically force people to get Russian passports, either to continue their jobs, to receive their pensions. Sometimes they'll just force you to do it, or they'll shoot you, as some report suggested in the early days of the full-scale invasion. So a lot of Ukrainians are going to have Russian citizenship through no fault of their own, through no desire of their own, simply because they live in areas that the Russians have occupied. And a law like that might make it very difficult to reintegrate them properly, especially if these are people who start trying to display any kind of political intentions. And again, eventually the occupied territories will have to be reintegrated. There will have to be local and parliamentary and presidential elections there. And it presages a very complicated and uncomfortable conversation if the Ukrainian government begins to use this rule or this ability to strip people of their citizenships if they're also discovered to have Russian citizenships willy-nilly or simply against political opponents. It's a big risk, though obviously it's a hard thing to argue against in the current situation, because currently, if you are in unoccupied Ukraine and you hold a Russian passport, you are almost certainly a spy, or you are at the very least a target for blackmail by the Russian intelligence services, which they have engaged in very often. And it's a hard thing to say, no, we should let people with dual Russian Ukrainian citizenships keep Ukrainian citizenship. Right now, I think it's a hard thing to argue against, but it very much should be an emergency wartime effort and not something that really remains past the end of the war. Though, given that we're not really sure when the war will end, maybe things will change drastically whenever the war does end. Currently, it's hard to say.
And in Ukraine, bills have a tendency to change pretty radically from the time of their first reading to the time of their eventual passing and signing and all that. Especially when it comes to issues like that have more of a national character to them. The first draft is often quite different from the final draft. But as Romeo said, this is an issue that for most people has not been a big deal. There are people that hold multiple citizenships, and it really hasn't mattered unless it's made to matter. A famous example that I'll always remember is that Ukrainian oligarch Ihor Kolomoisky was once questioned, well, you're not allowed to have dual citizenship, so why do you have Israeli citizenship, for example? And Kolomoisky responded that he's not a dual citizen, he's a triple citizen. He is Ukrainian, Cypriot, Israeli, therefore it's fine. He brushed right by the two straight to three. So it's pretty much an open secret in Ukrainian politics that the majority of parliamentarians have at least two citizenships. Anyone who has any amount of money in Ukraine, very often one of the first things they will do is obtain Cypriot or Bulgarian citizenships, because those are pretty easy countries to get citizens. It's literally just a cash payment. Yeah, they're called golden visas, for example.
Yeah, it's a cash payment and you get a passport. So it's very common in the political class. Offhand, I would wager to say that the majority or above 70% of sitting parliamentarians in Ukraine have dual citizenships, at least. Again, I don't mean this as a bad thing, just as a fact that the most powerful people in Ukraine do hold multiple citizenships. That's just a fact of life. The Ukrainian passport is not very strong. And if, for example, you do a lot of business with the EU, eventually, if you have the money, it makes more sense to gain an EU passport than to keep going through customs as a foreigner.
Yeah, it's really just legalizing an already existing situation. But this one is really keen into the diaspora angle, which is that, say you are Canadian Ukrainian, if you want to come back to Ukraine, build a business here, build a life here, well, you then have to make a choice. If you want to obtain Ukrainian citizenship, you cannot continue to have your Canadian or American citizenships. You have to renounce them.
Well, technically, you have to be in the process of renunciation.
So, well, again, this is all things, but that's something that a lot of people, especially our polite friends, might not be willing to bend too many laws to be technically correct. So this law, if it eventually passes in this form, will be used to basically invite the Ukrainian diaspora to come back to Ukraine, take up Ukrainian citizenship, become Ukrainian without having to complicate other home citizenships. Because, for example, I've lived in Ukraine long enough to go through the process of obtaining citizenship if I also want to go through, a bunch of other hoops that this law would also help simplify. But if I chose to, I could, but I would have to give up my American citizenship. And with the complicated relationship I may have with the United States, especially right now, and how it has scorned me, so I don't think that would be a wise thing to do, especially if I then have kids. They would not be able to have their American citizenship. So it's a big decision to make. It's a very strong passport to hold, the American one, and turning it in is a very complicated decision. And if it passes, then I don't know, maybe Ukraine and the EU take up that EU citizenship.
I mean, that's what my grandmother always said when I was a kid. Eventually we'll be in the EU, and then our weak passport will be an EU passport. One can only hope.
One can only hope. Baruch Hashem.
Speaking of the EU,
there's our segue.
Speaking of the EU, Romania recently had a election that it then canceled. So, Anthony, what's going on in Bucharest?
So, in our last episode, we focused a lot more on international topics in our last episode, but in case you don't want to go back and listen to it, just a brief recap was that Romania, like many parliamentary democracies, when they have their presidential election, it will usually go to multiple rounds. If you win 50+% in the first round, you win that first round and don't have to go to a second one. But if nobody wins 50% plus one, it goes to the second round, where the top two vote earners will then compete against each other directly without all the, 10 other candidates involved drawing away votes. And the two finalists for the second round of the election were a pro-European, pro-Ukrainian kind of center-right Euro-lib candidate named Lasconi, and a very far-right candidate named Georgescu. And as I described in the last episode, the explanation for why he was able to do so well largely came down to a last-minute Russian misinformation campaign where they really pumped a lot of money and effort and fake accounts, especially into TikTok. It turned out to be a bit of a TikTok election. And so there's a lot of questions of the extent of this Russian interference. And so because it was seen as Russia interfering so heavily in this election, the Romanian Supreme Court eventually, this was the update since last time, canceled the results of that first round of elections. This is not without controversy. The votes themselves were in the clear, and Lasconi, the other person who qualified for the second round, herself even said that by canceling democracy, our very freedom is canceled. Very strong words from Lasconi there, partially because she herself came from an outsider political party. None of the main political parties did very well in the presidential elections whatsoever, so they were definitely eager to claw back power. So it's a very complicated situation where the votes were fine. The candidates that people voted for were the candidates that were set to go to the second round. But at the same time, there was this Russian interference campaign. And since then, there have been a bunch of investigations into it, to the point where members of Georgescu's political movement, the Iron Guard, which, as I explained in the last episode, are Nazis. It's the Romanian Nazi movement.
If the name didn't give it away. The Iron Guard. Yeah,
the Iron Guard were a Romanian fascist movement who were too fascist for the fascist government of Romania. So they were prosecuted because of that, because they didn't think the government was fascist enough. But so this Iron Guard movement, there's been a lot of arrests. There seems to have been a extensive system in place to kind of interfere with the elections, to perhaps even attack voting places in the second round of the elections, of them building up weapons and all that. Extensive kind of covert system that is also very scary. You can't have that in a democracy either. So I'm very torn as to how the justifications for canceling the election, because what is liberal democracy? The liberal part and the democracy part sometimes interfere with each other.
I think that what we're actually seeing is a 20th century political system trying to grapple with the consequences of 21st century technology. It's no coincidence that this influence campaign was run on TikTok and that it was considered so influential by the Romanian courts that they feel it violated the integrity of their election, despite there not being any actual election fraud happening. We've seen over the past 10, 15, almost 20 years of how strong an effect social media has on people's brains. We've seen conservatives in the United States simply lose any connection to reality and their own sanity, chasing the social media trends. We've seen utter social media fabrications being pushed by far-right forces in Europe to justify increased oppression of migrants and minorities. We've seen social media be abused by autocrats in India and in China to cement the power of the ruling parties. Clearly, the tools and processes that we had in the 20th century and the processes that developed in a media landscape that was incomparable to our present day, that there's some tension here that has to be resolved somehow. In Romania, the courts decided to resolve it judicially. Maybe that wasn't the right decision, but it's hard to deny that social media has such an outsized effect on people's perceptions of the world, of reality, of their own values. And they are so suggestible on social media that something needs to be done. Surely something needs to be done. A large part of the rise of the far right across the world has been tied explicitly to social media campaigns. We've seen oligarchs buy up social media platforms with the explicit and successful goal of undermining democracy. Most recently with Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and then using it to turn into a far-right echo chamber. His efforts paid off. Donald Trump was reelected. To what extent Twitter played a role, it's hard to quantify, but certainly that extent was not zero. On top of that, Russians have been running these giant bot farms, these misinformation campaigns, targeting Western social media platforms. And again, they have been successful. A number of narratives have been spread by these programs that Ukraine still has trouble fighting against, that Ukrainians still have issues refuting, despite the fact that it's been many, many years. And it's clear that what the Russians said during these campaigns has no relation to their actual goals or motivations. And it is rather cheap, simple, and easy to set up an influence operation on social media. It is not a complicated process. It doesn't take a lot of technical know-how. All it takes is a few $1,000s in monthly salaries for underpaid teenagers or college students to sit in an office for a couple of hours a day. Get 20 of them, and there you go. You have a bot farm capable of fabricating narratives that will reach hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people within days. The liberal democratic systems that were set up in the 20th century, especially in the latter half of the 20th century, were not designed to operate in an environment like this. To be frank, almost none of our institutions and none of our systems are designed to work in an environment like this. And there will need to be a reckoning of some sort to resolve these tensions sooner or later, or we're just going to continue watching democracy slip out of our hands and into the hands of these oligarchs and state actors who can afford to run multi-hundred people influence campaigns at the drop of a hat.
And ultimately, Georgescu did have, an armed militia movement behind him, and you can't allow that kind of person to run in democratic elections in the first place. I think that can be one rule that can be implemented.
Or no, just let him win once, try a coup, fail, and then just run again. That's totally fine. That'll have no long-term lasting effects on the health of democracy.
Though with Romania, it's not like the United States where the president is all powerful. The power is still much more in parliament, and having one person outside of the system with no party support, he would not be able to do as much damage as he could in a system like, for example, the United States, and take everything we just said into consideration when thinking of the United States. So, but it is still a problem. But Romania, they decided to basically call a mulligan on these elections, just do over, and this will happen sometime in March. The date has not yet been set. Chchedryk will not be part of the next election, though Lesconi will be. So in March, we'll just have to see how that unfolds, or see if there's any blowback from the Iron Guard, who are currently being arrested, but are still, Nazis. And our next country to talk about is Georgia. Again, we talked about this in last episode, but the updates from that, as I said in the last episode, the government is becoming just more and more violent over time. One change in the level of violence that has happened is that the Tatushki, these armed thugs who are hired by the government to do their dirty work, they have extended outside of the main cities and are now even seen in villages. There have been a lot of anti-government or anti-Georgia Dream protests, even within these tiny villages of a couple thousand people, which is unusual for Georgia. Politics tends to happen in the cities, as is in many other countries. It's not unusual. But these government thugs have been sent out to the villages to rough people up there, and not just in Tbilisi. The Georgian parliament, which is now being considered illegitimate by the opposition because they lost the election, really, if not for ballot stuffing and various other measures we've already described in order to rig the elections. They are currently passing a law. They've already passed a law that would ban masks, to heavily regulate fireworks. And for this, we just have to look back at Ukraine during Euromaidan. There was something called the dictatorship laws. And many of these dictatorship laws, for example, banned people from wearing helmets. So, which is why there was a bunch of pictures of people wearing spaghetti colanders on their heads. It has a way to kind of mock this idea of not being allowed to wear helmets. But as silly as the response to these laws can sometimes be, they're deadly serious. They're being done to make being a protester on its own an illegal act. And the other update is that the parliament has elected a new president. In Georgia, typically in the past, the Georgian people as a whole would vote for the president. That has now been replaced with an electoral college system being made up of parliamentarians. They have elected amongst themselves Mikhail Kavelishvili. He is a former soccer player who, after retiring from soccer, became just a Georgia Dream proxy politician. He had his own political party, but it existed solely to do he's not an interesting figure on his own. He doesn't really do anything on his own. He has always been a puppet, and now he is becoming a puppet again. Again, the opposition is rejecting this decision because they do not consider the parliament legitimate. And so the current president, Zarabashvili, is not stepping down. So there is now a situation in Georgia where there's the still legal president of Zarabashvili and the Russian-installed Mikhail Kavelishvili. And so one does not recognize the other. Two presidents, one of them real, one of them not. Then, of course, like I said, the violence has increased. One opposition politician was attempted to be stabbed with a screwdriver. This could have killed them if it found a vein, but thankfully they are fine. But it's getting closer, inching ever closer to the Georgian government just straight up killing someone. It's the rate of increase of violence has reached the point where I think it could happen really at any day.
Pretty much no coverage of the Georgian protests in English language media. However, they've been going on for, I want to say, what has it been, 18 days now? And people are still thronging the streets of Tbilisi in their thousands every single day. There are continuing crackdowns and repressions by Georgian security forces against the protesters, while European powers have begun to call for dialogue and all the usual garbage. It's clear that these protests aren't going to go anywhere. They're not going to go away. And sooner or later, the government will have to act in some way to tamp down on them. Either they are going to accede to the protesters' demands, which, given the
it doesn't look
direction of the ruling party in Georgia, Georgian Dream, that is very unlikely, or they will start copying Viktor Yanukovych's tactics during Ukraine's Euromaidan and deploying police forces with live ammunition. And at that point, just like it was in Ukraine, things will escalate. How it will shake out is anyone's guess, though I will say it is probably for the best that the Russian Federation is unable to project military power outside of Ukraine at the moment.
Kind of like with Armenia, France is the country that has really shown the most interest in the Caucasus countries. And so Macron, of all European leaders, there's a lot of European sanction on Georgia right now. Well, at least they tried. There was an attempt in the European Union to pass stricter sanctions on the illegitimate Georgian government. And of course, the person who stepped in to prevent those sanctions was Viktor Orban. Corrupt autocrat solidarity between Orban of Hungary and the Georgia Dream Party and most other dictators. He has a fondness for dictators. So Hungary once again stepping in to be a spoiler here, just as they are a spoiler with Ukraine as well. Not big fans of Orban at this podcast or country or amongst free peoples of the world. But Macron has been much more forthcoming in his denunciations of the Georgian government on his own. The United States government, of course, as we've described in the past, has suspended a lot of its cooperation with Georgia. And Georgia, the Georgian Dream was really staking a lot of their legitimacy on the fact that they were still maintaining their relationships with the Western world. And so even with stepping away from some of the integration patterns, they could still keep all aspects of Georgian society mollified. Well, that is now very clearly not the case. And these governments like Macron, like the United States, are doing what I think is important and making it clear that no, whatever Georgia Dream is doing, it is not allowing for any kind of positive relationship with Europe or North America, which is what most Georgians want. So in our last topic of the episode, updates on Syria, where we last left off with Syria, the Syrian rebels were just outside the gates of the city of Hama, and the Syrian government was apparently disintegrating before this rebel advance. Well, you're probably not hearing it first from Ukraine without hype. It has been a pretty big deal. But what has happened since our last episode is that while the northern rebels essentially were still attacking Hama as the Syrian Arab army was trying to defend Hama, there was a simultaneous uprising in the south of the country between various basically underground cells of rebels who had been previously defeated by the Damascus government, and just going out to their sheds and digging up the guns they had buried and reforming into a new army, along with some other factions who were out in the desert supported by the U.S., but otherwise pretty minor factor in the civil war. They all rose up and marched on Damascus, took Damascus, and Assad fled the country to Moscow, apparently not even bothering to tell anybody, did not tell his aides, did not even tell much of his family, as it turns out, except for his immediate family.
After 13 years, the Syrian Civil War has concluded, and Bashar al-Assad is no longer in power.
After all these years of, we're pledging our lives and our blood to Assad, he just runs away without, with as much that he could carry over to Moscow. He put out a statement saying that, I didn't mean to do this. I wanted to stay and protect my country, but you ran. At the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion, President Zelensky very famously gave the comment of, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And I'm definitely not the first person making this joke. Assad making the comment of, I don't need ammunition, I need a ride. That's what the difference in leadership looks like, I suppose.
Now, there is a very interesting angle to the fall of the Assad regime. And that is the fact that the Ukrainian special forces were actually involved in the last rebel offensive that forced Assad out of the country. A few days after the rebels had taken Damascus, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Budanov, revealed that Ukraine had actually sent some 120 drones and 30 troops to Syria to assist the rebels in their advance. And this is at least partially corroborated by some reports from Russian soldiers at their bases. They were claiming that they were seeing the Syrian rebels operate drones in ways that Syrians have never had. They were using them in ways and tactics that they've never seen any Syrian ever do. And we know why, because those were very likely to be Ukrainian drone operators. And Ukraine has never been a particularly active player on the world stage, but we've seen that the full-scale invasion has forced the Ukrainian government to change so many things. And honestly, I take it as an incredibly positive sign that we contributed to the fall of Assad and that we were willing to risk our own men and equipment in that operation, an operation that was successful, that helped bring an end to 13 years of atrocity and genocide.
Of course, the stories coming out of Syria are horrifying, but also in their own way uplifting, because this horrible war is over. But at the same time, it means that they are uncovering the mass graves. They're going through the prison camps. They're discovering the bodies and the documents. And this is a process that will take years to go through all of these things. The people of Syria, there's pictures all over that they're putting pictures all over walls right now of, do we know where this family member went? He was arrested by the Assad secret police, the Mukhabarat, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and we don't know what happened to him. Can we find out what happened to him? And people are learning now.
The conditions that have already just been revealed, and again, these are the early days of kind of the truth part of the truth and reconciliation process post-conflict. And there have already, within the first days, we discovered that Sednaya prison, the infamous prison that operated by the Assad regime, where they sent hundreds of thousands of dissidents and just random people. And there was a wing of that prison where children had been born to female inmates and had never been outside and would have never gone outside. These are children that don't know what the sun is. Just utter horrific dystopic levels of dehumanization. And this is just what we are seeing now. What the horrors that additional years will uncover is hard to imagine compared to already the things that we know the Assad regime has done. But these stories will keep coming out. There will continue to be mountains of evidence of the horrific crimes against humanity that Assad is guilty of, along with, of course, the Russian forces, because the only reason that Assad even held power for this long was entirely and wholly due to Russian interference. Now, there is some complicated politics here. So the new Syrian government is headed by a man who went by the Nom de Guerre Abu al-Julani. I believe he's abandoned the Nom de Guerre now, but that's how everyone's known him for years and years and years. He is part of the kind of bigger rebel groups, HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which a lot of Western governments consider to be a terrorist organization. Though now that they have effectively taken control of Syria, they claim that they will be working on an integration process to integrate and consider everyone's viewpoints. Syria has obviously a large population of Christians, has a large population of non-Sunni Muslims as well. And it's a pretty diverse country, and the new government is going to have to manage that diversity somehow in order to build a functioning state. No one in Syria even the most hardcore rebels want to see the Civil War re-emerge. Absolutely no one wants this. They will, I believe, be working to stabilize their nation. And that requires making some complicated political choices, such as deciding what to do with the Russian military bases in Syria. While the Russians are known and widely seen by the Syrian people as Assad's enablers and coddlers, again, Moscow is literally where Assad ran to. The money that Russia pays in both rent for their bases as well as in oil is going to be sorely needed by the new government. They have no financial backers at the moment. They're still going to need to pay salaries to civil servants, to their security forces. They need to reestablish pretty much all the institutions. Everything they need is going to take money, and it's going to take cash, really. And Russia is one of the few actors willing to give them that cash. The Kremlin has already signaled that it is open for negotiations with the new authorities over their bases, though some reports have indicated that the Russians have started to withdraw from their bases. The Russians say they're still open to negotiations. Even the Syrians, Al-Jilani, has commented that the question of Russian bases in Syria is up for discussion. He didn't rule it out outright. And despite the, I think, obvious hatred that most Syrians hold for Russia, these kinds of choices are going to be more and more common, and they will need to be made one way or the other as the country recovers from the 13 years of ruination and starts to rebuild some semblance of a normal life.
And it's not just a matter of money either. Right now, Syria is currently seeing an invasion by Israel from the south and Turkey from the north. The rebel group that was used as a Turkish proxy, the Syrian National Army, is currently trying to destroy the autonomous administration of northeast Syria, often referred to in the West as the Kurds, but I explained my objections to that term previously, but the reason is because of the Kurdish factor there. Turkey wants the Kurds destroyed and are using their proxy in the country to do it, while Israel is claiming that they are expanding a buffer zone in the Syrian Golan Heights. So right now, Syria, in addition to trying to rebuild after a civil war and the various factional compromises they'll have to do that, is also having to acknowledge that Israel and Turkey, the regional powers, are also very interested in their country. And so they may want Russia there as a counterbalance to those two. Politics are often difficult.
Yeah, unfortunately, Syria's geopolitical situation did not change with the end of the Civil War. They are still a country sandwiched between Turkey and Israel. They are still a country on the Mediterranean Sea. Like, no matter how you look at it, the physical properties of the political territory of Syria has not changed. And all of the other actors that surround Syria have the same interests they had when Assad in power, and they will have the same interests no matter who's in power. And the new Syrian government is going to have to come up with some sort of solution. One of those solutions is likely going to be an effort by the new Syrian administration to unify all the disparate ethnic groups. For example, the Rahavan Kurds have signaled that they are willing to participate in the new government. Most of the rebel groups, even the Christian and left-wing rebel groups, have indicated they're willing to work with Jilani, despite the fact that HTS is explicitly an Islamist party. That is, they have an ideology of political Islam. Though again, Jilani has said that he will not be pursuing that to an extent that we've seen, for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan, where they just sort of threw out the government and replaced it with a fully Islamist regime. Jilani has said that he is not going to do that. But there are a lot of pressures on Syria, and there's a lot of guys with guns, and there's a lot of interest groups that are going to be poking their heads out and wanting to reassert or gain new power as the dynamics in Damascus shift. So despite the incredible feat of ousting the butcher Assad, the Syrian people, I'm afraid, do not have an easy road to reestablishing normalcy.
And just to bring Ukraine back into this discussion, one very important thing that happened is that Russia ended its supply of grain to Syria, and Ukraine immediately took up that responsibility. saying the Syrian people need to be fed, and so we will feed them. The Ukrainian government has been much more warm to the incoming Syrian administration than pretty much anyone else in the world. They have sent very friendly messages and have set themselves up to work at least on friendly terms with post-revolutionary Syria. Hopefully, this will serve as a buttress from Russia re-entering Syrian politics, but as we've described, there's lots of factors they have to take into consideration with that, and Russia may or may not continue to have a play in Syria. But Ukraine is definitely trying to counter Russian influence throughout the world, and Syria is definitely, in addition to, Sahel, Africa, a front where they are putting the most political efforts forward in order to do so.
I think we haven't discussed yet the effects of the fall of the Assad regime on Russia itself. And while these effects aren't immediately noticeable, I would argue that they are pretty wide-ranging. If Russia can no longer use its air bases in Syria specifically, Russia no longer has a way to Africa. Africa has become a major revenue source for the Russian government, especially considering all the sanctions, security contracts from oil companies to secure sites, contracts from rebel groups to defend their little oil fields from other rebel groups. Russia is making a lot of money in Africa. And then that's not even considering the sale of blood diamonds, drugs, and human trafficking, and all the other illegal crap that Russian mercenaries get up to. If Russia is no longer able to use these air bases, they don't have a really safe route to Africa in order to resupply their troops there and in order to take the loot back to Moscow. This is a big deal and can be a significant blow to the Russian economy and Russian government finances in particular. Unlike taxpayer money, which at least some of it has to go back into making sure the country, like the lights work and it is at least somewhat warm in winter, all the money that they've been earning and from their mercenary activities in Africa has been fed directly back into the military. That was one of Yevgeny Prigozhin's, the latter founder and commander of Wagner. It was one of his complaints that Wagner was not allowed to keep its loot, despite it being the guys that got the loot. So their inability to reach Africa safely is one pretty big strike to Russia. Again, that's not an immediate effect. Another major blow to Russia is the loss of their, let's say, credibility. Because in the end, they were not able to defend Assad against what was not, by all accounts, a very technically adept foe, despite all of the money and effort that Russia has put into securing Assad's regime, to propping up the Syrian Arab army. None of that in the end mattered, and Assad did fall. And this must give Russia's other autocratic partners at least something to consider as they're sitting across the table with Putin, eking out new deals to sell out their people. At least some of them must be thinking, well, I don't want to end up like Assad, and the guarantees that Russia gave Assad clearly are not infallible. But unfortunately, beyond that, those are the two main diplomatic effects here is the loss of Russian kind of diplomatic credibility and the loss of their ability, or potential loss of their ability, to supply their African adventurism.
Yeah, the kind of scripting that I did after the initial fall of Assad was I had a kind of episode written out to explain how this kind of collapses Russia's goal of creating a new grand bargain of how world politics works. Well, you can't have a grand bargain when it turns out that the only thing that Russia can maintain is its war in Ukraine while having to sacrifice all of its other imperialist goals because it just doesn't have the resources to work on them. So I guess next month I'll put that one out. But with that, we will be ending this week's episode. Thank you all very much for listening. We will have one more episode before the close of the year. I will do a rundown of Ukrainian history, one of my favorite topics, and one that I think some of you may enjoy. It has been requested before, actually, so it's not just me. But If you would like to support Ukraine more broadly, as always, you can turn to our link tree in our description and see various causes you can help support. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype as a podcast, please tell your friends and family about us. The more listeners, the better, especially now as we're entering, well, a complicated political problem of dealing with the incoming Trump administration. We'll rely very heavily on public diplomacy, public discourse. That means more ears, more eyes, the better. If you'd like to support us financially, you can please go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. I'd also like to invite you to patreon.com/NVUA to support our main employer, the New Voice of Ukraine, a very serious, buttoned up kind of outfit, unlike this one we have here. We all contain multitudes, more serious, less serious. That's us being more serious. So we would now like to thank all of our wonderful supporters. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazier, Randy McNerlin, the voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivana Kokratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri Litvin, Elizabeth Hughes, James Burke, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, PLM, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Abel, Aidan McDonald, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Ken Dystopian Fiction, Please Remain Fiction, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Pavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kyle Johnson, Laura DeLeon, Laurie Halila, Lemonikin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noah, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokyuk, Stuart Akers, Settle Knife, Ursula Zonko, Veronica Aim, William Brown, Zay Perry, and Marcus. That list is getting longer, which makes me happy, but takes longer to say. So thank you all very much for your support. You are what make us all possible. And coming into the new year, have a happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah, happy New Year. Thank you all very much. And Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.